Welcome to Animal Uncovered, the podcast where we explore the most unbelievable life cycles in the natural world. From the moment life begins to the moment it ends, nothing is as simple as it seems. Today we're going to examine something that exists at the boundary between the plausible and the nightmarish. Not a creature from folklore, not a thought experiment from science fiction, but an organism that lives among us, hidden in forests across the world, quietly rewriting the fate of millions of living things every single day. The Cordyceps fungus. If you've heard of Cordyceps, it's likely because someone told you about the fungus that turns ants into zombies. And while that description isn't entirely wrong, it barely scratches the surface of what this organism actually is, or how it accomplishes what it does. Because Cordyceps doesn't just kill, it reprograms, it navigates, it waits. And when the time is right, it transforms its host into something that serves a purpose the host could never have chosen for itself. This is not a story about monsters, it's a story about survival, about evolution pushed to its most unsettling extreme, and about a life cycle so precise, so intricate, that it challenges everything we think we understand about autonomy and control. So let's begin where all life cycles begin, with a single spore drifting through the air. Part 1. Before we go further, we need to be clear about what Cordyceps actually is, because it's easy to talk about the Cordyceps fungus as if it were a single entity, lurking in the jungle, waiting to pounce. But that's not quite accurate. Cordyceps is not one species, it's a genus, a family of fungi that includes over 400 known species, and likely many more that haven't been catalogued yet. These species exist all over the world, from tropical rainforest to temperate woodlands, and each one has evolved to infect a specific host or group of hosts. Cordyceps sinensis infects caterpillars in the Tibetan Plateau. Cordyceps militaris targets pupae and larvae of butterflies and moths. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, perhaps the most famous, specializes in carpenter ants. What unites them is not their appearance or even their habitat, but their strategy. They are entomopathogenic fungi, which means they derive their nutrition from insects. But they don't simply feed on dead tissue the way many fungi do. They invade living hosts, manipulate them, and ultimately consume them from the inside out, all while keeping them alive just long enough to serve the fungus's reproductive agenda. Cordyceps belongs to the phylum Mascomycota, the same broad group that includes yeasts, molds, and truffles. But somewhere in their evolutionary history, certain fungi within this group took a dark and specialized turn. They became parasites, and not just any parasites, but ones capable of commandeering the nervous system of another organism. So when we talk about Cordyceps, we're talking about a strategy, a way of life that has been refined over millions of years, and it all begins with a spore. Part 2. Picture a rainforest floor in Thailand, or the dense undergrowth of a temperate forest in North America. The air is thick with moisture, leaves decompose slowly in the humidity, and drifting through this world, invisible to the naked eye, are millions upon millions of spores. Cordyceps spores are microscopic, typically between 3 and 10 micrometers in length, small enough to be carried on the slightest breath of wind or the movement of an insect's leg. They are released from fruiting bodies, those eerie stalks that emerge from dead hosts, and once airborne, they can travel surprising distances before settling onto a surface. But travelling isn't enough. The spore needs to land on the right host, and this is where the specificity of Cordyceps becomes almost unnerving. Because these fungi are not generalists, each species of Cordyceps has evolved to infect a particular species, or sometimes even a particular caste within a species. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, for example, infects Camponotus leonardi ants, but shows little interest in closely related ant species living in the same environment. How does the spore recognize its host? The answer lies in chemistry. The surface of an insect's exoskeleton is covered in a thin layer of waxy compounds called cuticular hydrocarbons. These compounds vary from species to species, and the Cordyceps spore can detect them. When a spore lands on the correct host, it receives a chemical signal, a kind of molecular handshake that tells it, "This is the one." And then the infection begins. The spore adheres to the exoskeleton, using adhesive compounds that bond it to the surface. It germinates, producing a structure called a germ tube, a slender filament that begins to grow. This tube secretes enzymes, chitinases and proteases that slowly dissolve the tough outer shell of the insect. The process takes time, sometimes hours, sometimes days, but eventually the fungus breaches the barrier and enters the host body. Once inside, everything changes. Part 3. The interior of an insect is a world unto itself, a hemolymph-filled cavity where organs float, untethered, bathed in fluid that carries nutrients and waste. It is warm, wet, and rich with resources, and for the Cordyceps fungus, it is home. Upon entry, the fungus does not immediately form the long, thread-like structures called hyphae that most fungi use to grow. Instead, it produces yeast-like cells, single-celled bodies that bud and replicate, spreading through the hemolymph-like bacteria. This strategy allows the fungus to evade the host's immune system. Insect immune cells are designed to recognize and attack foreign hyphae, but these yeast-formed cells are small, mobile, and hard to detect. The fungus feeds on the host's tissues, drawing nutrients from fat bodies, muscles, and organs, but it does so carefully. It does not ravage. It does not devour indiscriminately, because the host must remain alive. The fungus needs the host to move, to function, to carry it to the place where it can complete its life cycle. And so the fungus grows, slowly, methodically, filling the host's body while the host continues to live. The ant, or beetle, or caterpillar continues to eat, to walk, to interact with its colony. On the outside, nothing seems wrong, but inside the insect is being hollowed out, transformed into a vehicle for something that is not itself. This phase can last for days or even weeks, depending on the species and environmental conditions. The fungus is patient. It waits until it has colonized enough of the host body, until it has accumulated enough biomass to produce a fruiting body, and then, when the time is right, it does something extraordinary. It takes control. Part 4. The question of how Cordyceps manipulates its host behavior is one that has fascinated scientists for decades, and the answer is still not entirely understood. But what we do know is both elegant and deeply unsettling. The fungus does not infect the brain. This is a common misconception, fueled perhaps by the zombie metaphor that surrounds Cordyceps. In fact, studies of infected ants have shown that the fungal cells carefully avoid the brain, growing around it rather than through it. The brain remains structurally intact, even as the host's behavior changes. So how does the fungus control the host without controlling its brain? The current hypothesis involves a combination of chemical manipulation and mechanical intervention. The fungus produces a cocktail of bioactive compounds, alkaloids, peptides, and other molecules that can alter neurotransmitter levels in the host. Some of these compounds mimic or interfere with the insect's own signaling chemicals, effectively hijacking the communication between the brain and the body. At the same time, fungal cells infiltrate the muscles and connective tissues of the host, forming a network that may physically manipulate movement. Imagine a marionette, controlled not by strings, but by threads woven through the very fibres of its limbs. The host's muscles contract and relax not in response to its own intentions, but in response to signals from the fungus. The result is behavior that is precise, predictable, and utterly divorced from the host's survival instincts. In the case of Cordyceps unilateralis and its carpenter ant hosts, the infected ant leaves its colony and begins to climb. It ascends the stem of a plant, moving upward with a kind of mechanical determination. It climbs until it reaches a specific height, typically around 25 centimeters above the forest floor, and a specific location, usually the underside of a leaf, and then it stops. The ant positions itself carefully, often on the midrib of the leaf, and it bites down. Its mandibles lock into the plant tissue in what researchers call the death grip. The ant will never release this grip. It will never move again. It has arrived at the place where it will die, and that place has been chosen not by the ant, but by the fungus. Why this specific location? Because it is optimal for the fungus's reproduction. Too high, and the air is too dry. Too low, and the humidity is insufficient for spore dispersal. The underside of a leaf provides shade, moisture, and a position from which spores can rain down onto the forest floor below, where other ants forage. The fungus has navigated the host to a location that maximizes its own reproductive success, and the host, with no say in the matter, has complied. Part 5. Within hours of the death grip, the host dies. The exact cause of death is unclear. It may be that the fungus finally consumes critical organs. It may be that the host simply exhausts itself, deprived of food and water during its final journey. Or it may be that the fungus releases toxins that shut down vital systems once the host is no longer needed. What is clear is that death is not the end of the process. It is merely a transition. Once the host is dead, the fungus shifts its strategy again. The yeast-like cells that fill the hemolymph cavity begin to transform into hyphae, those thread-like structures that allow the fungus to truly colonize the host's remains. The hyphae spread through the body, breaking down tissues, digesting what's left, and consolidating the fungal mass. And then the fruiting body begins to form. It starts as a small swelling, usually at the back of the head or between the segments of the thorax. Over the course of days or weeks, this swelling grows, pushing through the exoskeleton, rupturing the host's body from the inside. What emerges is a stalk, slender and often branched, rising from the corpse like a dark antenna. This structure, called a stroma, is the reproductive organ of the fungus. Along its surface, embedded in tiny flask-shaped chambers called perithecia, are the aciae, sac-like structures that contain the spores. When the fruiting body is mature, these asci rupture, releasing spores into the air. The release is not random. In some species, it occurs at specific times of day when humidity and air currents are optimal. In Cordyceps unilateralis, spores are released in the early morning, when the air is still and moist, allowing them to drift down through the understory and settle on the forest floor where ants are most active. A single fruiting body can release millions of spores, and each spore carries the potential to begin the cycle again. The host is gone, but the fungus endures. Part 6. Of course, none of this happens in a vacuum. The success of the Cordyceps life cycle depends on a narrow set of environmental conditions, and even small variations can disrupt the process. Humidity is critical. The fungus requires moisture to grow, both inside the host and during the formation of the fruiting body. In dry conditions, the fungus may fail to colonize the host effectively, or the fruiting body may wither before releasing spores. This is why Cordyceps is most commonly found in tropical and subtropical rainforests, where humidity levels remain high year-round. Temperature also matters. Most Cordyceps species thrive in warm environments, with optimal growth occurring between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. Outside this range, the fungus may grow too slowly to outpace the host's immune system, or too quickly, killing the host before it can be manipulated to the correct location. Light plays a subtler role. Some researchers have suggested that infected hosts may respond to light cues during their final climb, orienting themselves toward or away from light sources in ways that position them optimally for spore dispersal. The fungus may influence these responses, though the mechanisms remain speculative. And then there is timing. The fungus must synchronize its life cycle with the activity patterns of its host. If the fruiting body matures during a season when the host species is dormant or absent, the spores will fall on barren ground. Evolution has fine-tuned these rhythms, aligning fungal reproduction with host availability in ways that suggest millions of years of coexistence. But coexistence does not mean cooperation. It means conflict, and that conflict has driven one of the most fascinating evolutionary dynamics in the natural world. Part 7. For every adaptation the Cordyceps fungus develops, the host species evolves a counter-adaptation, and for every defense the host erects, the fungus finds a way around it. This is the evolutionary arms race, and it's been playing out for as long as Cordyceps and its hosts have existed together. Some ant species have developed behavioral defenses. Workers patrol the colony, inspecting one another for signs of infection. If an ant begins to behave strangely, if it moves erratically or becomes lethargic, the others may detect it and remove it from the nest, carrying it far away before the fungus can complete its cycle. Other species have adapted their nesting sites. Carpenter ants in some regions build their nests high in the forest canopy, far from the humid understory where Cordyceps thrives. The infected ants still descend and perform the death grip, but they do so away from the colony, reducing the risk of transmission. There is even evidence of chemical defenses. Some insects produce antimicrobial compounds in their hemolymph, compounds that can inhibit fungal growth. The fungus, in turn, has evolved enzymes that neutralize these defenses, or methods of evading them entirely. And then there is specialization. The fact that each Cordyceps species targets a specific host is not just a quirk of biology, it is a strategy. By evolving to infect one species extremely well, the fungus avoids competition with other Cordyceps species and maximizes its chances of successfully completing its life cycle. The host, meanwhile, evolves defenses specific to its particular fungal parasite, creating a feedback loop that drives both organisms toward greater and greater complexity. The result is astonishing diversity. Over 400 species of Cordyceps, each one a testament to the power of evolution to sculpt life into forms we could never have imagined, and each one locked in an endless struggle with its host, neither side ever truly winning, both constantly adapting. It's a reminder that evolution is not a story of progress, it's a story of survival, and survival sometimes requires doing terrible things. Part 8. But from a broader perspective, Cordyceps is not a villain, it is a regulator. Insect populations left unchecked can grow exponentially. A single ant colony can contain millions of individuals. A swarm of locusts can strip a landscape bare. And while predators play a role in controlling these populations, they are not always sufficient. Cordyceps provides another layer of control. By infecting and killing a percentage of the host population, the fungus prevents any one species from becoming too dominant. It maintains balance. In rainforest ecosystems, where biodiversity is staggering and competition is fierce, This balance is essential. Studies have shown that in areas where Cordyceps is active, insect populations remain stable and diverse. In areas where the fungus is absent or suppressed, certain species can explode in number, outcompeting others and destabilizing the ecosystem. The fungus also contributes to nutrient cycling. When a host dies and is consumed by the fungus, the nutrients locked in its body are eventually returned to the soil, either through the decomposition of the fruiting body or through the breakdown of the host's remains. This process enriches the soil and supports plant growth, which in turn supports herbivores, which support predators, and so on. In this sense, Cordyceps is a keystone species, an organism whose presence has a disproportionate impact on the structure and function of its ecosystem. Remove it, and the entire system shifts. The ants proliferate, the plants suffer, the balance tips. So while the life cycle of Cordyceps may seem grotesque, even monstrous, it serves a purpose that extends far beyond the individual host. It is part of the machinery that keeps ecosystems running, part of the invisible architecture that supports life on Earth. And yet, for all its ecological importance, Cordyceps has captured the human imagination in ways that have little to do with ecology. Part 9. You've probably seen Cordyceps in fiction. It appears in video games, most famously in The Last of Us, where a mutated strain of the fungus infects humans, turning them into mindless, violent creatures. It shows up in horror films, in speculative biology forums, in articles with titles like "The Zombie Fungus That Could End Humanity." And while these portrayals make for compelling entertainment, they bear almost no resemblance to reality. Let's be clear, Cordyceps cannot infect humans. It cannot infect any mammal. The fungus has evolved over millions of years to infect insects, and only insects. Its entire life cycle, from spore adhesion to behavioral manipulation to fruiting body formation, is tailored to the physiology of arthropods. Human bodies are too warm, too large, too biochemically different for the fungus to gain a foothold. Even if a Cordyceps spore were to land on human skin or be inhaled, it would be swiftly destroyed by the immune system. We have white blood cells, antibodies, inflammation responses, an entire arsenal of defenses that insects lack. The fungus would have no chance. The idea of a Cordyceps-like fungus evolving to infect humans is, in the words of most mycologists, biologically implausible. It would require not just a mutation, but a wholesale reinvention of the organism's entire strategy. A leap so enormous that it strains the bounds of evolutionary possibility. And yet, the fear persists. Perhaps because the real Cordyceps is unsettling enough that it doesn't take much imagination to extrapolate it into nightmare. Perhaps because the loss of control, the idea of something else steering your actions, taps into a primal anxiety about autonomy and selfhood. But here's the thing, the real Cordyceps is far more interesting than the fictionalized version. Because it doesn't need to infect humans to be remarkable. It doesn't need to be a threat to us to challenge the way we think about life. It does that just by existing. Part 10. So let's end where we began, with a question. What does it mean to be in control of yourself? We like to think that we are autonomous beings, that our actions are the product of our own thoughts, our own desires, our own will. We make decisions. We choose our paths. We are, in the most fundamental sense, ourselves. But the Cordyceps fungus suggests that control is not as simple as we imagine. Here is an organism that can take another living thing and redirect it, rewrite its behavior, guide it to a specific place for a specific purpose, all without the host ever knowing that it has been compromised. The ant doesn't know it's infected. It continues to behave normally, right up until the moment it doesn't. And even then, as it climbs, as it grips the leaf, does it experience any sense that something is wrong? Or does it simply feel the compulsion as if it were its own? We don't know. We can't know. But the question lingers, and it's not just a question about ants, it's a question about all of us. Because we too are biological systems governed by chemistry, by neurons firing, by signals we don't consciously control. We like to think we're different, that consciousness gives us sovereignty over our actions, but how much of what we do is truly chosen, and how much is simply the product of impulses, instincts, biological imperatives that we experience as desires but didn't author? Cordyceps doesn't answer that question, but it makes it harder to ignore, and perhaps that's why this fungus fascinates us. Not because it's monstrous, but because it's a mirror. It shows us a version of life where autonomy is an illusion, where the boundaries between self and other, between controller and controlled, are thinner than we'd like to admit. Out there, right now, in forests across the world, ants are climbing. They're gripping leaves. They're dying in positions they never chose, for reasons they'll never understand. And from their bodies, stalks are rising, releasing spores that will drift on the wind and begin the cycle again. It's happening quietly, without fanfare, without witnesses. Just another day in the life of an organism that has been doing this for millions of years and will likely continue for millions more. And if you find that unsettling, well, perhaps you should. Because the natural world is not here to comfort us. It's here to survive, and sometimes survival looks like this. If you enjoyed this episode of Animal Uncovered, following the podcast is the best way to support the show. And if there's an animal you want us to uncover next, leave a review or comment and let us know. Until next time.